All right. Well, welcome to Creekside Book by Book, and we are going to be looking at Leviticus 11 verses 11:1 through 13:46. And so this is where we're going to get into the really fun part of Leviticus. I know you're like, but I thought we were already having so much fun talking about the sacrificial system and all the different things. Today we're going to talk about clean and unclean animals. We're going to talk about uh, birth and like how to purify after childbirth. And then we're going to talk about skin diseases. So it's going to be great. Super fun. And as we are walking through these sections, one of the things to keep in mind is that one of the primary concerns in the people of God is as they're hosting the presence of God among them at the tabernacle. And so maintaining purity becomes even more important as they are recognizing that the holy God is choosing to let his glory dwell among them. And so anything that could cause impurity or uncleanness is to be avoided so that they don't bring the wrath of God on themselves. And so they're taking seriously the presence of God. And there are some things that we're going to look at today that we don't have clear answers on why something is clean or unclean. The text doesn't give us just a clear, this is why. It just says this is what it is. And so there's some different theories that we'll look at about those different kinds of reasons why people may have, why the certain animals were unclean and certain animals were clean. And then we're going to look at, another thing to keep in mind. As I was researching, the other cultures around this time had purity codes, but nowhere had as extensive a list of purity codes that as the people of Israel in the law in Leviticus. And so this is a pretty unique document, just in the fact of just looking at the scope of how much detail we have in regards to what is clean and what is unclean. And so this section of the manual of purity or the purity code really goes through 15. And then right in the middle of Leviticus, we have the Day of Atonement. And so, and then there's some more after chapter 16 that's going to talk more about sin and moral purity and impurity. And so that Day of Atonement piece is like this hinge that we're going to get to in a couple of weeks. But that's all leading up to that Day of Atonement. And then after Day of Atonement, we're going to talk about the sin that makes people unclean. And so what we're looking at here is the things that are clean or unclean are not inherently sinful, but they create a kind of impurity among the people if they interact with unclean animals or corpses of unclean animals. And so we'll just get into it. It's going to be a lot of things that may seem repetitive. Just heads up, we're in that section of the law. So let's jump to 11 verse 1. I'm reading out of the NIV in case you're following along with your Bible at home. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, say to the Israelites, of all the animals that live on land, these are the ones you may eat. You may eat any animal that has a divided hoof and that chews the cud. And there are some that only chew the cud or only have a divided hoof, but you must not eat them. The camel, though it chews the cud, does not have a divided hoof. It is ceremonially unclean for you. The hyrax, though it chews the cud, does not have a divided hoof. It is unclean for you. The rabbit, though it chews the cud, does not have a divided hoof. It is unclean for you. And the pig, though it is a divided hoof, does not chew the cud. It is unclean for you. You must not eat their meat or touch their carcasses. They are unclean for you. So one of the things to go back to Genesis, and we talked about the flood event in Genesis 9. After the flood, Noah's family comes out, and at that point, God says, you may eat animals. There were already some ideas of animals that were not pleasant and not clean, but this is where we really start getting some more specificity of cleanliness. And one of the things to look at as well is like the animals that were able to be offered as sacrifices for sin in the tabernacle. Those are all clean animals, and all the animals that are unclean were not offered to be offered as sacrifices ever. And so that's one of those distinctions that is helpful as we're looking at why are these things this way. And so even in the clean animals that were all allowed to be offered as sacrifices, they needed to be without blemish or any kind of defect. They needed to be pure, and they needed to be clean. And so here we're talking now outside of the tabernacle, outside of the religious system. The people of Israel are not to touch these animals or eat them or touch their carcasses. And so we'll see another one of these lists in Deuteronomy 14, and that's going to talk a lot about the dietary laws. But really, all of the ideas of clean and unclean foods come from these two chapters, Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. And as I was looking through the different systems, people had all kinds of theories about why some animals were clean and unclean. What were the distinctions? And all of these are speculation. We don't know for sure because, as we just read in the text, it doesn't tell us other than having a split hoof and chewing the cud. And cud is essentially like this is some of the most gross stuff that we're going to talk about for a while. It's a kind of like chewing like the grass, and then a bit of regurgitation and chewing it again. And so there's a processing there that these animals are doing with the grass and wheat or whatever they're eating. And so the split hoof and the cud, those are the requirements. And so all the different animals that don't meet both of those requirements are unclean, but those that do are clean. And so there are 6 common views on what these different distinctions between clean and unclean really are all about. And the first one is the symbolic view. And this is saying that the animals represent something else or a more practical spiritual nature, and it's based on allegorical interpretations. And we haven't really gotten into too much about what is an allegorical interpretation, but at the base level, the Bible means what it means. There is one meaning of the text, and so when we are trying to read the Bible today, we have to do our work to understand the author's intent and their meaning. But in different schools of thought, people would go back to the text and look for an allegorical reading, maybe a spiritual reading, to try to make sense of things that were not immediately clear. And so there were people like Philo, who is a classic writer, and he had all kinds of spiritual or allegorical readings. And so for him, like this example of chewing the cud indicated contemplation and reflection, while parting the hoof referred to making distinctions. So Philo's really reaching for something here to say chewing the cud, like these animals are showing what contemplation looks like. You eat the word of God and then you chew on it and like regurgitate it a bit and chew on it again, which is gross. So that's part of Philo's thing, the symbolic view. So that's one example. The ethical explanation is based on the notion that the dietary laws would reduce culinary possibilities for the Israelites and thereby reduce the number of times an animal would be slain. And so this restriction would consequently curb animal slaughter and thus teach the inviolability of all life. And so limiting the kinds of animals that could be consumed limited the overall use of animal life for human consumption. And so that's another view. That is one of the most weak sauce views, in my opinion. The aesthetic criterion for the dietary laws is based on the quality of an animal's appearance. A clean animal would be one that is aesthetically pleasant, while an unclean animal's appearance would be so repulsive anyone that it would repulse anyone, that it would create disgust if found on an Israelite's dinner plate. So just looking at like snakes, gross. Snakes are ugly and slimy and gross, right? They're not slimy. They just smell bad. And if you were served snake, the Israelites would be like, ew, we don't like those. Those are ugly. Those are not pleasant to look at. So that's one view. The hygienic explanation is based on the view that the Israelite dietary laws are God's way of protecting the Israelite from certain diseases. Foods that are harmful to personal health are unclean, which is looking at things like we're going to see that you can't eat scavenger animals. And one of the reasons could be because scavenger animals carry disease. And this is a way that the law is a protection against bringing disease into the camp. One of the animals that is unclean is bats. And we have, one of the theories around COVID-19 is that it was introduced as people into human population as people were eating bats. So like that kind of protection is what people would look at and say, yeah, see, the law was protecting us from these kinds of diseases. The morphological explanation is a little bit newer of an interpretation, and it's essentially saying that if an animal does not properly match its expectations, so the morphological focuses on the information in the biblical text regarding the locomotion and digestive procedures of certain animals, and concludes that the unclean animal is one that would depart from the normal locomotive and digestive habits of ordinary animals and thus be anomalous. And so like an animal that's like an in-between, it's not one or the other, is unclean. And so like if looking at like eels should be like fish, but they don't have scales, whereas fish do have scales. Fish are clean, eels are unclean, because they don't perfectly match the lineup for that, what a sea creature should look like. So the theological explanation suggests that unclean animals are those that are known to have played a role in pagan religion. And so like all these unclean animals could have been part of a sacrificial system in a different religion. And so the Lord is making this distinction to say, no, in my kingdom, those animals that are offered to the Baals are not to be consumed by my people. So that's another theory. So these are all theories. We're not really given a clear explanation on why these are why God wants the cloven hoof that chews the cud. God doesn't tell us. He just says these are clean, those are unclean. But the purity is important, as they are trying to honor God, and so they are going to follow these rules as best they can. And so let's keep going. Verse 9: of all the creatures living in the water of the seas and the streams, you may eat any that have fins and scales. So that's the fish part. But all creatures in the seas or streams that do not have fins and scales, whether among all the swarming things or among all the other living creatures in the water, you are to regard as unclean. And since you are to regard them as unclean, you must not eat their meat. You must regard their carcasses as unclean. Anything living in the water that does not have fins and scales is to be regarded as unclean by you. So like, not just land animals, there's also clean and unclean sea creatures. And so like shellfish, crab, those are if you look at the morphological explanation, like they are not land or sea creatures. They're an in-between. They also don't swim the way a fish swims. They don't have scales the way fish have scales and fins, and so they're unclean. It's very detailed. Verse 13, these are the birds you are to regard as unclean and not eat because they are unclean: the eagle, the vulture, the black vulture, the red kite, and any kind of black kite, any kind of raven, the horned owl, the screech owl, the gull, any kind of hawk, the little owl, the cormorant, the great owl, the white owl, the desert owl, the osprey, the stork, any kind of heron, the hoopoe, and the bat. And this is, again, these are all scavenger type birds that eat carrion animals that are already dead. And so that's one of the reasons why they lean into the why they're unclean. But then there's bats, and bats are, you look at the bat as it's, first of all, it's not a bird, and the people of Israel may not have, and at the time have made that distinction between mammals and birds that way, because it's a flying animal, and so, but it's a flying animal that doesn't have feathers, and so it is another one of those in between animals that is not one or the other. It's not a furry animal that crawls on the ground, and it's also not a bird in the traditional sense. And so it is one of those in between things that is not to be eaten. Verse 20, all flying insects that walk on all fours are to be regarded as unclean by you. There are, however, some flying insects that walk on all fours that you may eat, those that have jointed legs for hopping on the ground. Of these you may eat all kind of locust, katydid, cricket, or grasshopper. But all other flying insects that have four legs you are to regard as unclean. I love this. It's like God gives them like a gift. There are some bugs you can eat. So, but even here, like we look at like our culture, we don't eat bugs in American culture, but the many different cultures and people groups, they eat locusts and grasshoppers. They actually have a significant amount of protein for the size of the creature, and so the distinction here is that they have a joint that like basically knees, and so they are able to hop, and so yeah, again, we look at some of these things and we're like, I don't want to eat any of these, so why was this hard? But you know trying to help the people maintain purity in the culture, this is helping give clear guidelines for what is and is not acceptable. Verse 24, you will make yourselves unclean by these. Whoever touches their carcass will be unclean till evening. Whoever picks up one of their carcasses must wash their clothes, and then they will be unclean till evening. Every animal that does not have a divided hoof or that does not chew the cud is unclean for you. Whoever touches the carcass of any of them will be unclean. Of all the animals that walk on all fours, those that walk on their paws are unclean for you. Whoever touches their carcasses will be unclean till evening. Anyone who picks up their carcasses must wash their clothes, and they will be unclean till evening. These animals are unclean for you. And so here we start to get a little bit more understanding of what might contaminate you is if you find like a dead animal, a dead unclean animal, and you move it, like or remove it from your property, you're unclean. If you happen to touch it, you're unclean until evening. If you pick it up and move the carcass, you are unclean till evening, but you also have to wash your clothes. And so, this is, if you look at the hygienic reason that God is giving these kinds of commands, it could be, they didn't have the germ theory that we have now. And so this is one of those kinds of commands that could protect the people from disease, and making them wash their clothes, making them separated from the community for a period of time just to see like, hey, are they getting sick? Are they getting any kind of illness on them as they have been interacting with this carcass? So those kinds of things are helping them, again, protect purity. There is an interesting thing in here as well, like any animal that walks on the pads of its foot, of its paw, and so dogs, cats, those are also unclean. Like you're not supposed to eat dogs and cats in the Bible, whereas other cultures, they do eat dogs and cats. All right, let's talk about lizards in verse 29. Of the animals that move along the ground, these are unclean for you: the weasel, the rat, any kind of great lizard, the gecko, the monitor lizard, the wall lizard, and the skink and the chameleon. Of all those that move along the ground, these are unclean for you. Whoever touches them when they are dead will be unclean till evening. When one of them dies and falls onto something, that article, whatever its use, will be unclean. whether it is made of wood, cloth, hide, or sackcloth, put it in the water. It will be unclean till evening, and then it will be clean. If one of them falls into a clay pot, everything in it will be unclean, and you must break the pot. Any food you are allowed to eat that has come into contact with water from any such pot is unclean, and any liquid that is drunk from such a pot is unclean. Anything that one of their carcasses falls on becomes unclean. An oven or cooking pot must be broken up. They are unclean, and you are to regard them as unclean. A spring, however, or a cistern for collecting water remains clean, but anyone who touches one of these carcasses is unclean. If a carcass falls on any seeds that are to be planted, they remain clean. But if water has been put on the seed and a carcass falls on it, it is unclean for you. So, what is this? Essentially, like all these lizards and rat animals don't eat those, right? But then it goes on and talks about like cooking pots. And so, if any unclean animal or lizard or insect or anything like falls into a clay pot, what do you do with that? Especially if it's got some water in it. In the clay pot, like everything in there is unclean, right? And so it's not just wash the pot and you're good, because looking at clay, like the pot is permeable. The impurity can work its way into the whole pot, and so you have to just destroy the pot. And these clay pots would not have been overly expensive, and so making more was not something that would have been a problem, as well as the ovens that they needed to cook in, like the clay based ovens, or even a oven that has like some kind of rock structure. Just take it apart, do it again, and keep in mind these folks are nomads, and so they are probably used to building and rebuilding ovens at this point. But then there's this exception if an unclean animal falls into a spring or a cistern, and this could be simply because the amount of water that is in there may maybe the theory that people are putting forward is that it is big enough to dilute the impurity. But there's also a bit of grace here that, like, the Lord is not requiring people to get rid of their large sources of drinking water. And especially as they're in the desert, in the wilderness, they are still going to need to drink. And so they don't have to start over, which is a kind of grace as well. And so later, when they have more metallic pots and cups and that kind of stuff, washing something that is not permeable like clay, like that's a different situation. But here, anything that's clay must be broken and not reused. Verse 39, if an animal that you are allowed to eat dies, anyone who touches its carcass will be unclean till evening. Anyone who eats some of its carcass must wash their clothes, and they will be unclean till evening. Anyone who picks up the carcass must wash their clothes, and they will be unclean till evening. And so even with clean animals, like a carcass is a carcass, and the Lord is requiring that they separate themselves from the community. They're unclean till evening, just to like purify themselves. Now, they don't have to offer any kind of offering or anything like that. If they move the carcass or eat any of the meat, they must wash their clothes. And so death and impurity, these are all closely related. All right, 41. We're almost done with the animal piece. So every creature that moves along the ground is to be regarded as clean. Unclean, it is not to be eaten. You are not to eat any creature that moves along the ground, whether it moves on its belly or walks on all fours or on many feet. It is unclean. Do not defile yourselves by any of these creatures. Do not make yourselves unclean by means of them, or be made unclean by them. I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy. Do not make yourself unclean by any creatures that move along the ground. I am the Lord who brought you up out of Egypt to be your God. Therefore be holy, because I am holy. These are the regulations concerning animals, birds, every living thing that moves about in the water, and every creature that moves along the ground. You must distinguish between the unclean and the clean, between living creatures that may be eaten and those that may not be eaten. One of the underscore points in this section: be holy as I am holy. And the Lord is inviting the people into relationship with him, and he is pure, he is holy. He is inviting the people to also practice purity, and to do everything they can to avoid impurity. And so this chapter has two functions. First, it tells the Israelites the different ways they could contract ritual impurity from unclean animals and carcasses, and how they can purify themselves. Second, it gives them that official list of which animals were ritually pure, and so therefore they could eat them, and which were impure, and so they could not eat those. And so we see in these laws that the Lord is setting his people apart. It also underscores God's holiness, and then these laws serve as a reminder to seek purity in all of life. And we've heard this expression, the Lord says, be holy as I am holy, and is referred to in the New Testament. And one of the things that it's funny when people like make that claim or say that, like, the Lord calls us to be holy as he is holy. It's like, well, this is, and he's talking specifically about food laws, as we like, that's where we first encounter that. And so it's like, okay, well, be holy as God is holy. And so how do we do this today when we also recognize that, for Gentiles, these food laws in the New Testament are not carried over? Clean and unclean foods are not the same concern for Gentiles as they were for Jewish believers. Now, if you were to say, as a follower of Jesus today, I want to honor the Lord and I'm going to practice kosher laws, these food laws, you're free to do that. And, it might be a blessing to you, but it is not something that that the church or any Christian should enforce as a part of their regular discipleship of as followers of Jesus. So there are some movements that do hold to kosher laws, but it is not a necessary part when you read the New Testament. So then it shifts to in chapter 12. The text shifts to address ritual impurity from different matters, and so it starts with focusing on the human body, and so it starts with purification after birth, and then it looks at diseases in chapters 13 and 14, and then impurity after loss of bodily fluids in chapter 15. And so today we're going to get through most of 13, and then we'll do 13, 14, 15 next week, and maybe get to the Day of Atonement. Maybe there's a lot. So I'm going to read the whole of chapter 12 because it's all about childbirth, and it's not a very long chapter. So the Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, a woman who becomes pregnant and gives birth to a son will be ceremonially unclean for 7 days, just as she is unclean during her monthly period. On the 8th day, the boy is to be circumcised. Then the woman must wait 33 days to be purified from her bleeding. She must not touch anything sacred or go to the sanctuary until the days of her purification are over. If she gives birth to a daughter, for 2 weeks the woman will be unclean, as during her period. Then she must wait 66 days to be purified from her bleeding. When the days of her purification for a son or daughter are over, she is to bring to the high priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting a year-old lamb for a burnt offering and a young pigeon or a dove for a sin offering. He shall offer them before the Lord to make atonement for her, and then she will be ceremonially clean from her flow of blood. These are the regulations for the woman who gives birth to a boy or girl. But if she cannot afford a lamb, she is to bring 2 doves or 2 pigeons, one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering. In this way, the priest will make atonement for her, and she will be clean. And so as there's some interesting things that just kind of jump out here. But one of the points in all of this, as we think about like purification after childbirth, is not the point is not that having children is sinful. That's not the point of why they would be impure. It's really about the loss of blood, and um, loss of blood, any kind of interaction with blood, really does create an uncleanness and impurity for people outside of the regular worship and sacrificial system. And so here, a mother who gives birth to a child is impure for 7 days. If it's a boy, and a girl, it's 14 days. Why? We don't know. Doesn't give us a clear answer. And there are some theories that people have about why it would be different for boys or boy children or girl children. And even those theories are strange. Like, they don't make super great sense. But the initial 7-day period plus 33 additional days brings that total for a boy child to 40. And then the thinking is that the postpartum blood flow can last anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks. So this would be a suitable approximation to cease any kind of bleeding. And so Persian and Greeks also had a similar system of a 40-day restriction concerning entering any kind of sacred area after giving birth. And then others also required longer periods of purification for girls. And so some of the theories for girls state that it's just a sexist law. So that's one, like, it's just sexism. Another theory is that it must be remembered that some cultural traditions find their root in a specific historical circumstance. For example, the Israelites didn't eat the meat off of the thigh bone because the angel of the Lord touched Jacob, dislocated his hip. And so the people of Israel didn't eat that part of the animal, right? And so there may be an explanation in the history of the people of Israel that we don't have that explains why they need to wait twice as long for after a girl child is born. And then finally, the Israelites themselves may not have had specific rationale, but simply viewed it as an expected practice because God said so. And so that's where we land. But there's no clear consensus of interpretation on why the differences are happening. The fundamental reason for why this purification impurity is considered is just loss of blood. Everybody seems to agree on that. And so the loss of blood keeps people from entering into the holy places. And so the looking at one of the reasons why they would keep women away as well from the holy places is because they wanted to they could have wanted to emphasize that the Lord is not a deity that is focused on fertility. Like, he's not, like, it's not that, you had this baby and then you like come into the tabernacle right away and make sacrifice. And no, it's like this, he cares about blessing families and all of those things, but he is not a fertility god like the Baals in the land of Canaan. And so there may be a distinction that is being made in the worship of Yahweh compared to the other gods. But when they do offer these offerings, they are these purification offerings that are standard purification offerings. We have the year-old lamb as the burnt offering, a young pigeon or a dove as the sin offering, unless they can't afford the lamb and they bring the 2 birds. And one of the things that we see in the Bible is in the birth of Jesus is his parents, when they are doing these offerings, they bring the two birds, which is an indication to us, and I've said this before, but just an indication to us that Jesus' family was poor. They were not wealthy. And so even in the ways that Jesus identifies with humanity, it comes down to like economic distress as well. I find that fascinating. And so all of these different theories about the impurity and the timelines and all this stuff, it still just comes down to like they are making an offering here at the end of their period of impurity to recognize their restoration and into right relationship with the Lord. And so it is not it's not a like way to earn God's favor as much as it is just to like, or it's just to say like, God, I'm coming back into your presence. So yeah, I just want to make sure I didn't leave any major thing out. When we look at the offering for the firstborn, the Lord says earlier that every firstborn is mine, and so they make an offering as a substitute, as a way of saying, Lord, we thank you for this child and this kind of stuff. And so this again is an offering of thanksgiving, an offering of celebration, to say thank you, Lord, for life. And we dedicate our children to you, but we don't, nowhere in the Bible does the Lord ever ask the people to actually sacrifice their children, which is a part of some of the pagan cultures around them. And it will be one of the reasons why the Lord will bring judgment on the people of Israel and Judah in the future, is because they were practicing these kinds of things with the pagan idolatry of their neighbors. And so idolatry is always so close to the people of Israel. And when you read the book of books of Kings and Chronicles, and you see the idolatry throughout the land, it is heartbreaking. Like, they have the law, they know what they should do, but fundamentally they don't follow the law because the king doesn't make the law the priority, and the king holds the responsibility for leading the people in righteousness. And so when we look to Jesus, he is our prophet, our priest, and our king, and we trust him because he perfectly fulfills the law for us in all regards. And then chapter 13. Let's transition over to 13. It's going to start talking about skin conditions. And one of the ways that we think about skin conditions here, and some translations might call these different skin diseases leprosy. But I want to leprosy is also known as Hansen's disease. And what we call leprosy today, most scholars that I read about, they recognize that wasn't really something they ever talked about until the time of Alexander the Great in the ancient Near East, like where Israel is. And so they probably were not talking about leprosy as we know it, but like rashes and boils and those kinds of things that would create some kind of discoloration or damage of the skin. And the reasons for these practices of isolation with these skin diseases and purification, all of these different things, was to try to quarantine the skin disease, to keep it apart from the community so it didn't spread. And I mean, we just went through 15 months of practicing social distancing and trying to self-quarantine and keep a virus from going throughout our community, to mixed results. And it's one of those things that we have germ theory. They did not have the germ theory that we have. They didn't. And so here we have these really great laws like that are trying to protect the people from spreading disease. And it's in the Bible for us. And so we should be mindful that if you're not feeling well, love your neighbor, stay home. It's okay. It's okay. So let's look at chapter 13. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when anyone has a swelling or a rash or a shiny spot on their skin, that may be a defiling skin disease. They must be brought to Aaron the priest, or to one of his sons who is a priest. The priest is to examine the sore on the skin, and if the hair on the sore has turned white and the sore appears to be more than skin deep, it is a defiling skin disease. When the priest examines that person, he shall pronounce them ceremonially unclean. If the shiny spot on the skin is white, but does not appear to be more than skin deep, and the hair in it is not turned white, the priest is to isolate the affected person for 7 days. On the seventh day, the priest is to examine them, and if he sees that the sore is unchanged and has not spread in the skin, he is to isolate them for another 7 days. On the seventh day, the priest is to examine them again, and if the sore has faded and has not spread in the skin, the priest shall pronounce them clean. It is only a rash. They must wash their clothes, and they will be clean. But if the rash does spread in their skin, and after they have shown themselves to the priest to be pronounced clean, they must appear before the priest again. The priest is to examine that person, and if the rash has spread in the skin, he shall pronounce them unclean. It is defiling skin disease. When anyone has a defiling skin disease, they must be brought to the priest. The priest is to examine them. And if there is a white swelling in the skin that has turned the hair white, and there is raw flesh in the swelling, it is a chronic skin disease, and the priest shall pronounce them unclean. He is not to isolate them, but because they are already unclean. All right, so I have a basic flow chart for this whole section that I want to show you. And it is in this book. Sorry, I have to scroll to it. I'm going to share my screen with you in just a minute. Scrolling. I mean, I read a lot about skin disease this week, so you're welcome. Share screen. This. Share. All right. So, can you see that all right? You're all not cameraed right now, so I can't see you. So the priest examines the sign of the potentially ritually defined skin disease. Signs clearly indicate presence or absence of ritually defined disease. Priest makes official pronouncement. Person is impure or pure. So if it is, like, they can make that clear. If it is inconclusive, they are quarantined to see how the signs develop. So they put them in quarantine for 7 days and wait to see what happens. And then the priest, after that 7 days, can make that pronouncement of whether or not they are pure or impure. Now, this kind of a flow chart is helpful, especially as we're reading through these commands, because it's like a lot of it is like, well, we don't know, but while we don't know, let's keep them apart so that we don't spread this disease. And so, the priest can, serve here kind of like a doctor that is just looking at what could make them pure or impure. And so this first case is like a raised lesion, discoloration, rash. But the question is it just skin deep or is it deeper? Because if it's deeper, then it's probably spreading. And so they want to clarify that. And so let's keep going. Verse 12. If this disease breaks out all over their skin, and so far the priest can see it, it covers all the skin of the affected person from head to foot, the priest is to examine them. And if the disease has covered their whole body, he shall pronounce them clean. Since it has all turned white, they are clean. But whenever raw flesh appears on them, they will be unclean. When the priest sees the raw flesh, he shall pronounce them unclean. The raw flesh is unclean. They have a defiling disease. If the raw flesh changes and turns white, they must go to the priest. The priest is to examine them. And if the sores have turned white, the priest shall pronounce the affected person clean. Then they will be clean. And so here we have an example where like the rash or something has gone through their whole body. And so as it starts to change color from like red to white, that's part of the healing process. I mean, we've all had scabs that's, like you cut yourself and the scab starts fading, right? And so if it's already fading, then they're clean. But if it's clearly exposed flesh, like it's an open wound, then it is unclean and they should be isolated. And part of the isolation too, like if you have an open wound, something to keep in mind is like infection can get in there. And so keeping them away from any source of infection is also important. Verse 18. When someone has a boil on their skin and it heals, and in the place where the boil was, a white swelling or reddish white spot appears, they must present themselves to the priest. The priest is to examine it, and if it appears to be more than skin deep and the hair in it has turned white, the priest shall pronounce that person unclean. If it is a defiling skin disease that has broken out where the boil was. But if, when the priest examines it, there is no white hair in it, and it is not more than skin deep and has faded, then the priest is to isolate them for 7 days. If it is spreading in the skin, the priest shall pronounce them unclean. If it is a defiling disease. But if the spot is unchanged and has not spread, it is only a scar from the boil, and the priest shall pronounce them clean. And so this is again focusing on whether or not you can tell if the wound is spreading, if it is affecting the coloration of body hair. You know, it's one of those things that's like, this is not good. So we should isolate, keep them separate so that they don't spread it, but then also give them a chance to heal, again, for that 7 days. Verse 24, when someone has a burn on their skin and a reddish white or white spot appears in the raw flesh of the burn, the priest is to examine the spot. And if the hair in it has turned white and it appears to be more than skin deep, it is a defiling disease that has broken out in the burn. The priest shall pronounce them unclean, and it is a defiling skin disease. But if the priest examines it and there is no white hair in the spot, and if it is not more than skin deep and it has faded, then the priest is to isolate them for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest is to examine that person, and if it is spreading in the skin, the priest shall pronounce them unclean. It is a defiling skin disease. If, however, the spot is unchanged and does not spread in the skin but has faded, it is a swelling from the burn, and the priest shall pronounce them clean. It is only a scar from the burn. And so here it's looking, sounds like when you read it, like this burn may be infected. And so the infection is the problem. And so that's what they're looking for. But if it's already fading, it's already healing, then you're not, you are clean. If it is clearly a spreading infection, then you are unclean. If, verse 29, if a man or woman has a sore on their head or chin, the priest is to examine the sore. And if it appears to be more than skin deep and the hair in it is yellow and thin, the priest shall pronounce them unclean. It is a defiling skin disease on the head or chin. But if when the priest examines the sore, it does not seem to be more than skin deep and there is no black hair in it, then the priest is to isolate the affected person for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest is to examine the sore. And if it has not spread and there is no yellow hair in it, and it does not appear to be more than skin deep, then the man or woman must shave themselves, except for the affected area, and the priest is to keep them isolated for another 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest is to examine the sore, and if it has not spread in the skin and appears to be no more than skin deep, the priest shall pronounce them clean. They must wash their clothes, and they will be clean. But if the sore does spread in the skin after they are pronounced clean, the priest is to examine them, and if he finds that the sore has spread in the skin, he does not need to look for yellow hair. They are unclean. If, however, the sore is unchanged so far as the priest can see, and if black hair has grown in it, the affected person is healed. They are clean, and the priest shall pronounce them clean. When a man or woman has white spots on the skin, the priest is to examine them, and if the spots are dull white, it is harmless rash that has broken out on the skin. They are clean. Again, more specificity here. It's not, there's not a lot of variation as we continue on through here, but it's again looking, examining, isolating as necessary to see if it is spreading or if it is not spreading. And the discoloration of hair is part of the it's part of the way to tell. Like if it's like yellowish, and instead of the dark hair that most of the Jewish people would have had, then it's like, all right, this is something to watch. Something's happening here. It may still be spreading. But if it's white or if the black hair is growing, if darker hair is growing back, then it is, they are clean, and so they're healed. Verse 40, a man who has lost his hair and is bald is clean. So just losing your hair is not a problem. So if he has lost his hair from the front of his scalp and has a bald forehead, he is clean. But if he has a reddish white sore on his bald head or forehead, it is a defiling skin disease breaking out on the head or forehead. The priest is to examine him, and if the swollen sore on his head or forehead is reddish white like a defiling skin disease, the man is diseased and is unclean. The priest shall pronounce him unclean because of the sore on his head. Anyone with such a defiling disease must wear torn clothes, let their hair be unkempt, cover the lower part of their face, and cry out, unclean, unclean. As long as they have the disease, they remain unclean. They must live alone. They must live outside of the camp. All right, so if you are balding, that's not a sign of sin in people's lives. But if there's like a clear like wound of some sort or a lesion, and that's causing your hair to leave, then you should isolate and practice all of the skin disease protocols. And then it goes on to the behavior of the people who are affected by these different skin diseases. And essentially, this isolation, they're to be outside of the camp. They are to dress like they are in mourning. So they don't, their hair is unkempt, they wear torn clothes, all of these different things as a way of visually signifying to the people that they are unclean. And so this is a difficult thing. If it's only the 7 days, then and you're brought back into the covenant community after doing all the purification rituals, awesome. But for some people, this could be the rest of their lives. They could be separated. They could be apart from the community, and so there is a real sense of grief and sorrow that that we should keep in mind here. So we read things like this and we're like, oh wow, this is a lot of detail. This is a lot of just crazy, intense stuff. But again, it is about maintaining purity in the camp and keeping the people of Israel pure. And so as they are walking through all these different rituals, purity is the focus. Now, fast forward to the New Testament, because Jesus heals lepers. He is not afraid to touch lepers. But when he heals lepers, we see him say, now go and present yourself to the priests so that they can declare you clean. And so this is one of those things that when we read through what leprosy is considered in the Old Testament, like there is a protocol for being brought back into covenant community. And so that's what Jesus is doing. So when we talk about Jesus fulfilling the law, he is able to heal people, but he is still calling them to walk in righteousness and to go to the priest, to go and be declared clean officially. And one of the reasons why could be just to give verification of the miracle that has been performed, but it could also just be because he wants to make sure that, they are welcomed officially into the community. Because just having the miracle and being done with the miracle, like there are still things to do. Like people may think, like if you have a skin disease on your torso and you're wearing clothes all the time and people know that you were unclean, and then you just show up one day and like, no, I'm totally fine. Prove it. Well, they could prove it with the priest's verification. And so Jesus, many of his miracles really are about bringing people back into the community of God, taking away whatever unclean spirit, unclean disease, whatever cleanliness, impurity is in their life, and he's removing it from them so that they can be brought in to right relationship. And so we'll pick up next week with molds and cloths and that kind of stuff, and then go into other bodily disease and discharge and all kinds of super fun stuff. So it's going to be just a couple of really great weeks. So any questions or thoughts as we wrap up for this evening on this this really fun group of passages? Any questions? All right, good. Anybody not feeling like they're going to have any kind of food for a while because there's like, oh, skin disease. Oh.
sounds like people with psoriasis were just kind of out of luck.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's the hope is that they could see that it is just skin deep, and like it wouldn't be a ongoing thing. But yeah, psoriasis is a real concern. So, and that's
Yeah.
probably what many of these things were, like very similar to that kind of disease. So, yeah. Um, I live with a nurse. And so reading these kinds of things, because I'm married to a nurse, I don't just live with a nurse, I'm married to a nurse. So a lot of these kinds of things, like I hear all kinds of like just gross stories. And like, it's like, please stop, please stop. She has no problem talking about these things in any environment, dinner, weddings, wherever. And so it's one of those things that's like, I'm kind of uh, immune to thinking, well, this is gross. To just being like, well, this is just part of the human body. But I do get it. Like some of these things are like, oh, not pleasant. Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts?
This is carrying my thought. I was reading back on the part where um, the animal that you were allowed to eat, you know, well, when they're basically, is it about when, if you're allowed to eat it, if you're slaughtering it, you were unclean till evening?
No. If these carcasses, it's like if the animal just dies, is the
Okay, so if
way
you
it's
got it
read.
on the side of the road, you were trying to be kind and move it off the roadway. You were kind of
Yeah.
like unclean till the evening, even though you're doing a kind act.
Right. Yeah. Because there may be disease in the animal. Like keep that in mind. And so you are doing a kind act in clearing the roadway for others, but you may still have brought some impurity into your life. And so
Yeah.
to continue the kind act for others, being removed from regular activity with the community is a way to keep, like just one more buffer to keep from spreading any kind of impurity.
So
So
even
it's
if
not,
you like picked it with your sandal, kind
yeah,
of
if you touch
nudged it
it,
with your sandal, you were just like, ooh.
yeah, if you touch it, you are unclean, impure. It is not a, one of the things to be and keep in mind is it is not a discipline for your good deed.
Yeah.
Like that is not the purpose of the law of like you're unclean until evening. It is not about being disciplined for touching the body of an animal. It is about protecting you and the community from spreading impurity.
I kind of wish they would expound on that, because did they just leave dead animals lying all around their encampment? That would invite rats and nastiness, because people are like, oh, I can't touch this.
So
That's kind of weird.
I don't, I think that because they had such a high level of purity culture, like not, that's a loaded term, but purity mentality in their community, they probably were pretty diligent about making sure that they didn't just have dead animals around. Like they probably were like doing the like clearing out animals that may have died, because they don't want these unclean animals to enter into the camp either. And so they were probably pretty on top of it, knowing that I'm willing to be unclean for a day to help my community be clean in general. So
You know what? It kind of makes me think of garbage men. Like
yeah,
a designated day. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah,
ooh.
yeah. It may have been something where they took turns. Maybe they were on call. Maybe there's some people who are just like, man, I love moving dead animals. I don't know. So, but like they couldn't go. Being ceremonially unclean means they also could not go into the tabernacle. They couldn't go into the courtyard around the tabernacle to offer offerings and that kind of stuff. And so that was the major risk, but it was not in any way a punishment for moving an animal. So
I'm just wondering if they just designated one, like a few people of their whole clan, that you guys are the
yeah,
designated ones to do this.
maybe, yeah, doesn't tell us. So like we could come up with system for them, but they never tell us in the Bible like it was Shmuel's day to move the dead animals. So
Yeah. I guess my curiosity expounds. It's like I wish we could expound. I wish the Bible expounded on this, so you
Mhm.
knew, every little aspect of it, not just the kind of little bit of overview on it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And then there's all kinds of stuff that the Bible expounds upon about skin disease, where you're like, I get it. I get it. That's enough.
Well, that also makes me wonder when we get to the skin disease part where you had to present yourself to the, priest. That kind of, I don't know if it's just me, but it kind of makes me think that they're alternate, like a doctor, like what a doctor would be in our scenario.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the priests are the most educated people in the community. So they're the ones who know the law. They're the ones who know what to look for. They did not have a school system to create doctors in the wilderness. Later they may have developed particular doctors who could then direct people to priests. Like we know Luke was a doctor in the New Testament, but Luke was also a Gentile. He was not a Jewish person. And so like he's coming from a completely different culture than the Jewish people. So yeah, but the role of the priest in the regular life of the people of Israel is very important, and that's one of the reasons why, in the wisdom of God, the priests don't have their own section of the land. They're spread out throughout the whole community because everybody needed them. Everybody needed a priest close by, because like if a skin disease starts breaking out in a family, like that priest needs to be able to intervene in the situation quickly. Like you can't just say like, well, Solomon, take your family down to Jerusalem for a 2-day walk and then find out if you're clean or unclean. You need to know now so that they can be put into the isolation protocol to keep the community pure and to keep defilement out of the community. So yeah. So these laws are expansive. There's a lot that the Lord is telling the people to do, but it is also a great resource for them to be able to see like exactly what God requires. So yeah. Any other thoughts or questions?
I also thought my 2 cents worth. I thought it was over the top. They had to break all the stuff,
Yeah.
pots and all that. I was
Right.
like, that's kind of over the top.
Yeah, but like, if you're just drinking from a clay cup, the cup has all kinds of holes in it. And so that is one of the things that like that impurity worked its way into the holes in the cup, and you can't just soap it out.
Right.
It's in there. So that's why you just break the pot and or the cup, and it wouldn't be overly expensive to just make another one. So it probably was not a great hardship, but also it made sure that the people were being diligent about keeping their space clean and keeping insects and bugs and all kinds of stuff out of their environments, because insects and bugs also carry disease. So yeah. Catherine asks, would having a cat or dog as a pet make you unclean? The Jewish people did not generally keep dogs or cats as pets. And so they may have done that because they thought that it would make them unclean. So if anybody's watching The Chosen, it's great. I really, really like it. And I've been like talking it up as much as I can. But one of the characters ends up adopting a dog, which like that's the only thing that's annoyed me so far in this whole series, is like he wouldn't have done that. Even a bad Jew wouldn't have done that. And so like somebody who was not good at following Torah, like he wouldn't have done that. So that was just annoying. But it was a cute dog because I love dogs. So, but I'm also a Gentile. So yeah, so that's a good question, Catherine.
You're right on that Chosen. That movie, The Chosen. I've started watching it. A couple of them, the series, pretty good.
It's really good. I can't say enough good things about it. Like every time I think about it, I just am another level of just like, I appreciate how good this is. So yeah. All right. Well, you guys have, if there aren't any more questions or comments, let's go ahead and wrap up. It's the moving up day at youth group here. And so they're having a pizza party. So my kids are super excited because cousins are coming. So yeah, so I will let you guys go and see what if my kids are done yet, because they're usually done by now. So have a good week. I'll see some of y'all Sunday. Yeah,
Yep.
God bless.
Right.
Bye, guys.